It is my great pleasure to introduce Steve Pifer, who will speak to us about the Russian-Ukrainian war. So Steve, it's all yours.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm going to assume I can be heard unless somebody starts going like this.
You're good.
Okay. Well, we're all on the West Coast, so we probably know that the big strategic challenge facing the United States over the next several decades is China. But let me note that there's only one country today that could physically annihilate the United States in a matter of hours. That's not China, it's Russia. And it's Russia that has launched the largest war in Europe since World War II ended in 1945. And the planning for this war, I think, actually, in retrospect, began well over a year ago. In April of 2021, the Russians organized a series of military exercises near Ukraine. And they carried out the exercises. And when the exercises were done, most of the troops went back to garrison, but they left behind a lot of the equipment. And then the Russians began deploying more equipment in October, November, setting the stage for the war that began on February 24. There are, I believe, really three reasons behind this war. The one is a geopolitical concern in the Kremlin. The concern is the Kremlin wants to have Ukraine in Russia's sphere of influence. And the Kremlin became concerned that Ukraine was moving too far towards the West. Now, I would argue that nothing has done more than Russian policy over the past 8 years, beginning with Russia's use of military force to seize Crimea, and then Russia's involvement in the conflict in Donbass in eastern Ukraine, which had taken 14,000 lives even before the invasion that began in February of this year. And that's pushed Ukraine away from Russia and towards the West. A second factor is really about domestic politics in Russia. And that is, for the Kremlin, a democratic, Western-oriented, economically successful Ukraine is a nightmare. Because that's the kind of Ukraine that's going to get the Russian public to begin asking questions such as, why can't we in Russia have the same political voice, the same democratic rights that they have in Ukraine? And you need to remember that for the Kremlin, job number one is regime preservation. And then the third factor here, and very important factor, is Vladimir Putin. Fundamentally, Mr. Putin does not accept the right of Ukraine to exist as a sovereign and independent state. He has a very distorted view of Ukraine's history, a history that he displayed both in a lengthy essay he published a year ago, and also in an hour-long speech he gave on February 20, 3 days before the war. And it's a history that most historians simply do not recognize. And I think about 2 weeks ago, he said the quiet part out loud. He compared himself to Peter the Great and said he was gathering back former Russian lands. He views most of Ukraine as former Russian territory. I'd make the point that this is very much a war of choice. Ukraine posed no military threat to Russia. And I'll just give a few facts here. On February 1, if you looked at the Russian military and the Ukrainian military, Russia had 4 times as many men under arms as Ukraine did in terms of active duty military forces. Moreover, the Russian military had been largely modernized over the past 10 years. Ukraine, until the flow of Western equipment came, Ukraine largely was using Soviet-era equipment. And over the last 15, 20 years, Russia typically has spent 10 times as much per year on its defense budget as Ukraine did. And one other fact, Russia today has about 4,400 nuclear weapons. Ukraine has none. However, if you went back 30 years to the early 1990s when the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine had on its territory the world's 3rd largest nuclear arsenal. And Ukraine chose to transfer those nuclear weapons to Russia for elimination, in large part because in 1994, Russia committed to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity, its sovereignty and independence, and it committed not to use or threaten to use force against Ukraine, of course, commitments that Russia has grossly violated. Now, in January, before the war began, the Russians were expressing concerns about security in Europe. There was an effort by the West to propose a series of arms control risk reduction measures, things that we know well how to do from the 1980s and the 1990s, and address some Russian concerns and would have enhanced European security in general. The Russians simply weren't interested. So the Russian military launched a major invasion of Ukraine on February 24. based on the varied axes of attack, they came into Ukraine from Belarus in the north. They came into Ukraine from Crimea in the south. They invaded on several vectors from Russia in the east. And it really suggests that there were two goals. One was to take Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, within the first few days. And then the second was to occupy perhaps the eastern half to 2/3 of Ukraine. And it's pretty clear that the Russian military is not succeeding in those objectives. They utterly failed to take Kyiv. In fact, at the end of March, they withdrew their forces from near Kyiv, and they withdrew their forces really from northern Ukraine after suffering significant personnel losses and significant equipment losses. In the south, they were able, after a 3-month siege, to occupy Mariupol, which is fairly close to the Russian border. But after 2 weeks, their offensive that was headed towards the west along the Black Sea coast bogged down, and they fell well short of their goal, which was to occupy Odessa. And by the end of March, it was pretty clear the Kremlin understood they were not going to be able to achieve those original goals. So they reoriented and they said, our focus now is Donbass. That's the 2 oblasts of Ukraine, the Donetsk Oblast and the Luhansk Oblast. Russia refers to these as the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, Russia having recognized them as independent states back in February. Now, in a way, Russia's actually kind of tied its hands. People were looking at Vladimir Putin to see what he might say on May 9. That was Russia's commemoration of Victory Day over Nazi Germany. And he didn't, for example, declare war. He did not declare general mobilization. This, in Russian terms, is still a special military operation. And in fact, if you're in Russia and you say it's a war, you can be charged with violating the law and discrediting the Russian military, which carries a sentence of up to 15 years in prison. But by not mobilizing, Putin has basically put himself in a position where Russia cannot send draftees overseas. They cannot do stop loss. So there are about 130,000 Russian soldiers who have completed their 1-year term as conscripts and are leaving the military. And there are other limitations which constrain him. So because he's tried to portray this war as something less than a full war, he's actually limited his ability to mobilize the Russian military. And what you've seen really over the last 3 months is Russia focusing on Donbass, a change in tactics. The Russians have shown that they can learn, and they're making use of their advantages in artillery for this slow grinding war, but making fairly slow progress. They now have occupied just about all of Luhansk Oblast, but they still have quite a ways to go if they're going to try to occupy Donetsk Oblast. And it looks like this is settling into a war of attrition. So I think what we've seen over the past 4 months, we're now in month 5 of the war, is really a string of Kremlin miscalculations. First of all, and this astonishes me to this day, the Russians completely underestimated the fact that Ukraine would resist. Had you asked me, had you asked any Western expert on Ukraine, they would have said the Ukrainians will resist. I was in Kyiv at the end of January, about 3 weeks before the invasion. And when you would talk to people not in the military and say, what are you going to do if the Russians attack? The answer often was, I'm going to join the Territorial Defense Force. I'm going to get an AK-47. I will defend my country. That seems to have come as a total surprise to the Kremlin and the Russian general staff, which is just amazing. The Ukrainians reported that in one of the convoys they destroyed north of Kyiv in the early weeks of the war, they found boxes of dress uniforms, which they assumed was for the victory parade that never happened in Kyiv. A second thing that you saw on the Russian part was really an overestimation of the Russian military capabilities. And the war, to my mind, has revealed a couple of things. One, Russia, lots of corruption there. The defense sector is not immune. And a lot of the bright, shiny toys that the Russians bought for their military over the last 10 years don't seem to work as advertised. So there was one report they bought 60,000 tactical radios for communications. Those radios don't work. So the next best thing is your cell phone. There was one story that said it was about 14 minutes from the time a Russian general went on a cell phone until the Ukrainians put a drone overhead and released a missile to end that general's life. So you see that, and you also see, I think, a real flaw in how the Russian military is organized. It's very Soviet. So, for example, non-commissioned officers, and talk to people in the U.S. Army, they'll say NCOs, senior sergeants, and warrant officers, they run the American Army. They have authority. You don't have a similar structure in the Russian military. You don't have an NCO corps that knows how to lead. And junior officers, lieutenants and captains also don't have that much authority. So one of the reasons why a remarkable number of Russian general officers, I think a dozen now, have been killed in this war, is they were actually going to the front to do things that in the American military would be led by a major or colonel. And that's hindered them because they're fighting this very centralized war, whereas the Ukrainians seem to be fighting in a much more decentralized fashion. Another underestimation by the Kremlin was the strength of the Western reaction. I think Putin looked at the West and said they're divided. And however divisions we may have had, if you look at what happened since February 24, the West really has come together. NATO is basically united. NATO is reinforcing its eastern flank. NATO is providing weapons to Ukraine. You saw this at the summit that took place on Wednesday and yesterday. And in a real surprise to the Russians, Finland and Sweden, two countries that for decades pursued policies of neutrality, have now concluded that their security interests are better served by joining NATO. And on Wednesday, NATO formally invited them to join the alliance. The other thing that the Russians underestimated was the strength of the sanctions that came from the West. For example, if you talked to Vladimir Putin on February 1, he would have said one of the real assets he has to deal with the crisis is that the Russian central bank has $630 billion in foreign reserves. And that was his rainy day fund. The problem for Mr. Putin was half of those assets were held in Western financial institutions. They've all now been frozen, so they're not accessible by the Russian government. A second thing I don't think they anticipated was the cutoff of high-tech exports to Russia, things like semiconductors, chips, where Russia really has no domestic production capacity. And what you're now seeing is Russian factories beginning to shut down because they don't have their inputs. There was a report yesterday, and this was using statistics that were released by the Russian government, that year on year, auto production in Russia is now down 97%. TV production is down almost 50%. The production of diesel locomotives is down 2/3. So lots of factories are basically coming to a halt as they use up their stocks of Western high-tech inputs and are going to shut down. And so you're beginning to see, I think the mayor of Moscow a month and a half ago said he expected within weeks to have 200,000 jobs just evaporate as facilities shut down. You're also seeing, I think, what was not expected was an exodus of Western companies from Russia, even companies that are not affected in any way by the sanctions. It's more than 1,000 companies have now left. And I don't think these companies are going back for a while. I mean, if you're British Petroleum and you've left Russia and written $26 billion off, it's going to be a long time before you feel comfortable going back to your stockholders and say that you're going back to Russia. So there's lots of things happening, and they will have an impact. It may take a little bit of time, but the Russian central bank head is predicting that inflation in Russia will soon be at 20 to 23%. The World Bank predicts that the Russian economy this year will contract by 11%, and the Russian central bank expects the economy to contract between 8 and 10%. Now, the one missing piece here, which the West is still trying to come to terms with, is how do you cut off imports of Russian oil and gas, or at least cut back the flow of revenues? And there's some progress being made, but that's actually fairly slow, and that leaves sort of a loophole in the sanctions. But aside from that, and this is where I guess I would give the Biden administration quite a bit of credit, is they really have managed the diplomacy, both with NATO, but also with the European Union and other partners, for a strong military response, but also for sanctions that I believe surprised the Kremlin and even surprised some people in the West with how robust they were. So why the miscalculations in the Kremlin? I'll give you a couple of ideas here. One is, I don't think the Kremlin and I don't think Putin understand Ukraine, which is strange because they've been neighbors. Putin says they're all one people, but that reflects, to my mind, that Putin does not understand Ukraine. The last time he was in Kyiv was in 2013. And he gave a speech in which he said, "We Russians and Ukrainians are one people." And that's an utterly tone-deaf thing to say in Kyiv, because for Ukrainians, what they hear is, "You've denied my language, my culture, my history." Putin continues to repeat that. Part of the problem, I think, is Putin, and this is tradition, for many years, he operates in a very closed circle. And if you look at the other members of that closed circle, they tend to have security service backgrounds like he does. A group of people, a group of men who share the same outlook, the same worldview. And it's unclear how much information gets into that group. How much is in an echo chamber? How much are people prepared to tell the boss bad news? And I believe that we've seen over the past 2 years, because of COVID, that inner circle has become even more compressed. You haven't seen Putin meeting a lot of people. When he does, it's quite extraordinary physical separation. This week, Putin, I believe, spent a night in Tajikistan, that's a former Soviet republic. As far as anyone can tell, that's the first time he's slept outside of Russia since January of 2020. And I believe that that COVID impact has further compressed the kind of information that he gets. So he's not getting a full amount of information that might allow him to make different decisions. I think there's one other factor is I basically believe that Vladimir Putin is a rational actor. He looks at costs and benefits. He looks at potential gains, potential risks. But I also believe that in the last 15 years, he has become more emotional and more angry when it comes to Ukraine. And that, to some extent, is clouding the judgments he's making. To be sure, in February of this year, Russia had the largest military in Europe, but Ukraine is the size of Texas. And a lot of analysts in February, even before the war, were saying, could the Russian military really not only occupy that territory, but then successfully maintain an occupation? So we have the war, it's going to continue. There's a question, are negotiations possible? I do believe that Ukrainian President Zelensky would like to stop the killing. I think it personally pains him that Ukrainians are getting killed every day. And if you go back to the early weeks of the war, there were, I believe, genuine efforts by the Ukrainians to try to offer some compromises. Zelensky said, we're prepared to set aside our ambitions to join NATO. We will accept neutrality. And there was also some language that suggested to me that Ukraine was even prepared to compromise on issues like Crimea, which was a pretty delicate question. But there was no move by the Russians away from maximalist demands. And what's happened in the last 3 months, I believe, is that Ukrainian attitudes have hardened, both in the government, but also in the public. And you see that I think Zelensky, who may have been prepared to offer some compromises 3 to 4 months ago, now no longer is prepared to do it. And even if he was, I'm not sure he could sell those compromises to the Ukrainian public. And that's a result of a couple of factors. One is the Ukrainians themselves have probably been surprised at how well their military has done. But two, more importantly, they've seen what the Russians did to Mariupol, which is a war crime. 90% of the buildings in Mariupol were destroyed or damaged. I believe, we don't know the true count, but thousands, if not tens of thousands of people were killed in the Russian assault there. And just leveling a city like that indiscriminately, that's a war crime. And then you had the atrocities that were revealed when the Russians occupied towns such as Irpin and Bucha and Borodyanka. And I think that has hardened the Ukrainian attitude. The Russians may look at those kind of terror tactics and believe this will undermine the enemy's morale. I believe it's had the opposite effect, and it's hardened the resolve of the Ukrainians. So there was a poll that just came out that said now 89% of the Ukrainians oppose any kind of territorial compromise as a way to end the war. And I think that's going to make a negotiation difficult. So where does this thing go? I mean, ideally, to my mind, the Kremlin would actually weigh up the cost and look at things, at least 15,000 Russian soldiers, maybe more, have been killed in action. Huge losses of equipment. The Russians are now bringing T-62s. These are tanks, or T-64s, tanks that were built 50 years ago out of reserve to make up for equipment losses. The impact of the sanctions, what they've done to consolidate the West against Ukraine, Russia. And the Kremlin would look at that and say, this is no longer worth it. How do we find a way out? But I don't think that that's very likely with Putin. Putin seems to be doubling down. Now, it does seem to me that the Russians cannot achieve their original objective. However this conflict, however this war ends, at the end of the day, there will be a Ukraine on the map of Europe. But how the war ends is going to be unclear for a while, because it looks like it's now settling into this war of attrition. And a lot of military experts are now predicting that after this, taking Luhansk and maybe one last try to occupy the rest of Donetsk, that the Russian military may become a spent force, unable really to sustain a coherent offensive because of the combination of loss of personnel, loss of equipment, and really poor morale on the part of their soldiers. Where on the other side, they're fighting Ukrainians who believe this is an existential fight. They understand in Ukraine that if they lose this fight, their democracy is gone, and the vision that many Ukrainians, particularly young Ukrainians, have of Ukraine as a normal European state is also gone. And so there's a lot of suggestion here that the difference in will and morale and commitment on the Ukrainian side, how much can that offset the Russians' advantage in numbers and such? And the question maybe is, can the Ukrainians in fact stop the Russians? I think there's a good possibility of that. I'm less sure that the Ukrainians could then mount a counteroffensive to push the Russians completely out of Ukraine, because at that point, a lot of the advantages that accrue to the defender would be on the Russian side. So this is what, in fact, the Director of National Intelligence said a couple of days ago. The most likely scenario is this war of attrition where it goes on, but neither side is capable of making a major breakthrough. Let me cut a couple of comments on the Biden administration policy. I think they hit it about just the right spot. Political support for Ukraine, major sanctions on Russia, arms and serious arms now providing, including advanced rocket systems and artillery to Ukraine, but also drawing a red line saying we will not provide American troops. And NATO said the same thing. NATO will not provide NATO troops to defend Ukraine. And I believe that's the right red line. Right now, Russia could lose this war, and it would not be existential for Russia. It would be difficult for Vladimir Putin. But if Russia loses this war, Ukraine is not going to invade Russia. There will be a Russian state. But I believe that if the Kremlin and the Russian elite saw the United States and NATO sending forces to fight alongside Ukraine, that would fundamentally change the conflict in the view of the Kremlin. It would then become existential. And at that point, the risks of escalation would be very, very real. But what I do think the administration needs to keep doing, and it's doing this, is continuing to provide weapons that will give the Ukrainians the tools to defend themselves, and continue to look at ways to tighten sanctions, particularly on Russian oil and gas, that will raise the level of pain, economic pain to Russia. Because our goal should be to raise the costs that will help the Ukrainians persuade the Kremlin that it's going to fail. And at the end of the day, that Kyiv will win, Kyiv will prevail. And I define Kyiv prevailing as one of two things happens. Either the Ukrainians drive the Russians out of Ukraine, at least back to the borders as of February 23, or the Ukrainians get into a position where there can be a negotiation that produces a settlement that is acceptable to Kyiv. And it seems to me that that should be the US and Western goal, is to help the Ukrainians get into that position. And I very much hope that we stick with our current policy, which appears aimed at doing precisely that. So let me start off at that point. I would be happy to take questions.
I'm sure we have lots of questions. I have one. In relative size, how large is the Russian economy in terms of world scale?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, the Russian economy, probably before the war, was about a $2 trillion economy. So it was probably about 1/10 of what the United States and Europe, probably even less than that. Now that's on straight dollar terms, and I think that economy is now contracting in a very real way. And this, I think, is one of the questions: is does support for Putin, which is quite high by most polls in Russia, does that begin to erode as the economic pain sets in? But more importantly, as the flow of Russian casualties continues to grow.
You answered my follow-up question. So thanks. Buddy.
Hi, welcome. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. Put things into perspective very nicely, so thank you very much. We put things in perspective. Two questions, real quick. NATO and timing. What was the resistance of Ukraine coming into NATO prior to February 25th? And then why February 25th? What triggered Putin to decide now is the time to attack?
Yeah, well, let me take your last question first. Again, I think that in retrospect now, particularly looking at the Russian military exercises conducted more than a year ago in April of 2021, and the fact that they left so much of their equipment near Russia, near Ukraine, I believe that they were at least preparing the ground and were preparing for a major military operation well over a year ago. The NATO question, I mean, there has been resistance in NATO, particularly in the last 8 years, to bringing Ukraine in, and I think it's fairly understandable, which is even before February 24, before this latest Russian invasion, Russian troops occupied Crimea. Most of the world recognizes Crimea still as Ukrainian territory under temporary occupation, and Russian forces were alongside Russian proxy forces in the occupied part of Donbass in eastern Ukraine. And so a question a NATO member might well ask is, well, if we invite Ukraine to join NATO and Ukraine joins NATO on Monday, is NATO then obligated under Article 5, which is the attack against one is considered attack against all, under that article, then to go to war against Russia? And I think what you've seen is in the West, a lot of readiness to provide the Ukrainians with defensive assistance and billions of dollars now of ammunition and artillery and anti-tank weapons and highly sophisticated rockets, but not prepared to send their troops to go to war. And I think that's been the biggest barrier for Ukraine. And I don't know how you overcome that. So I think, and this is one of the things, I mean, in the run-up to the war, the Kremlin tried to portray this as a crisis that was engendered by NATO enlargement. I think that's totally bogus. The last NATO member that borders Russia, with the exception of Finland, which just got invited to join 2 days ago, the last NATO member that borders Russia were the Baltic states, and they joined in 2004, 18 years ago. And actually, if you go back to 2002, there was a NATO-Russia summit at which Vladimir Putin agreed to leaders of NATO, we will deepen cooperation between NATO and Russia. We will give a new quality to that cooperation. And Putin agreed to that in May of 2002, knowing full well that NATO leaders were going to meet later that year and invite other countries, quite probably including the Baltic states, to join. He didn't have a problem with NATO enlargement then. And what I just said about this reluctance in NATO to put Ukraine on the membership track, that was well known to the Russians. The Russians understood that as long as there are Russian military forces occupying Ukrainian territory, that was going to be a huge impediment to the ability of Ukraine to join. So for all of the talk about this is about NATO, I think that was basically just a Russian smokescreen.
Jim Margaret has a question, and then we'll get to the back of the room again.
Thanks again, Stephen, for your great presentation and your work for these years. A couple of questions. I may have missed something as well. What do you see as the likelihood that Putin uses either tactical nuclear weapons within Ukraine or launches nuclear weapons outside of Ukraine? That's the first question. Second one is, what do you see as the economic and humanitarian impact on the world with the loss of Ukrainian exports of wheat and other resources over the next 6 to 12 months?
I'll start with the second one. I mean, potentially it's a pretty major impact. Ukraine, over the last 5 to 10 years, has really emerged as a major supplier of grains to the world market. And it's believed now that Ukraine has sitting in silos and storage areas between 15 and 20 million tons of grain that it would like to export, that it traditionally exports to countries in the Middle East and Africa, but it can't get it out. And that's going to be a problem because to the extent that those silos are full, it also is going to be difficult then for them to bring in this year's harvest. Now, there's some work going on. The Turks are trying to broker some kind of arrangement between Russia and Ukraine that would allow the export of grain. That hasn't moved as fast as many people would like. And I'm kind of questioning in my own mind at the end of the day if the Russians are prepared to actually allow that to happen. On the first question, I guess I can give you an optimistic answer and a more pessimistic answer. The pessimistic answer is that if you look at the words Putin used when he announced the special military operation on February 24, what he called the special military operation, as I said, most of us in the West would call it a war or invasion. He talked about an existential threat to Russia. And if you look at Russian declaratory policy for nuclear use, the Russians basically say there are two circumstances in which they would use nuclear weapons. One is if there was an attack on Russia or Russian ally with a nuclear weapon or some other weapon of mass destruction. Or two, if there was a conventional attack on Russia in which the existence of the Russian state was at stake. And again, I think Russia can lose this war and the existence of Russia is not at stake. But, the continued leadership of Vladimir Putin could be at stake. And I worry a little bit that he is beginning to see an existential threat to his political future as an existential threat to Russia. So that's the pessimistic concern. But the more optimistic view is, you look at Vladimir Putin over the last 15 years, he talks a lot about nuclear weapons, even when he's not making nuclear threats. And I believe that reflects, first of all, the fact that for Putin, his image of Russia is we're a great power. We're one of the big players in the world. But a big part of Russia's claim to being a great power on par with the United States or China, or to the extent that European is a coordinated body, is because Russia has a lot of nuclear weapons. You take those nuclear weapons away, and Russia's power status really begins to change. So I think that's part of it. A second reason why I'm more optimistic is that although Putin said that he was putting the Russian military on a special combat regime, a nuclear alert back at the end of February, the Pentagon has said consistently over the last 4 months, they have seen no change in Russian nuclear posture. The sorts of things that you would expect to see if there was a real nuclear alert, ballistic missile submarines leaving ports going out to hide in the oceans, mobile intercontinental ballistic missiles dispersing from garrisons to spread out in the vast tracts of Siberia. That's not happening. And there's a third factor is that while Putin and some pundits talk about nuclear things, you haven't seen anybody in the Russian senior military leadership talk about that. And to my mind, that reflects the fact that these guys are a lot more sober. They understand that any use of nuclear weapons, even the tactical nuclear weapons, opens up a Pandora's box, and that the consequences there are unpredictable and potentially catastrophic. So I look at these comments and I think they're designed primarily to intimidate the West, to make us more nervous, and they probably succeeded to some extent. But I thought the best reaction when Putin announced his special nuclear alert back in February came from the French. And it was very simple. The French just said, well, we have nuclear weapons too.
Great.
Good morning. Thank you very much for your presentation. I think we've all really learned a lot, enjoyed it. My question, let me preface. One of the analysts I like to read is a fellow by the name of Peter Zion. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's big on the large movements of history, geopolitics and demographics and that sort of thing. And the point he makes about Russia is their demographics are turning so negative and have been for decades that the country itself is basically in its death throes before this started. And I wondered if you would comment on that.
Yeah, no, Russia's demographic picture was not pretty. There are about 145 million Russians today. The projection of the United Nations is that the Russian population could fall down to around maybe even as low as 130 to 135 million by 2050. Yeah, what's happening now, though, and I just saw an article, I guess, yesterday on this that said the demographic picture now is bad. First of all, the bulk of the casualties of Russians that they've lost, again, probably 15,000 young men. That's going to have an impact. But also, this is sort of a continuation going back to COVID. that you saw Russian families in 2020 and 2021 having less children. And people said that's because of the uncertainty about COVID. And you now, I think, have this continuation of the uncertainty about what's going to happen with the war with Ukraine. Economic circumstances. Families, I believe, ordinary Russians are going to see their economic circumstances begin to change in a fairly negative way. And so that's going to, I think, depress the number of children that are born in Russia. So I think there's a pretty major demographic problem here. One of the things the Ukrainians are concerned about is the Russians evacuated or offered a number of Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine the option to leave areas that were under assault by going to Russia. And the Ukrainians are now concerned that, for example, Ukrainian orphans that were evacuated to Russia are now being put up for adoption by Russian families. That's actually technically a sign of cultural genocide. But there may be a desire in some parts of Russia that by occupying some more Ukrainian territory, do they then occupy areas with more ethnic Russians that can help ease their demographic situation? I don't think it's going to work. I mean, what's been interesting to me is that I believe this war going back to 2014, what the Russians have done is they forged a Ukrainian national identity. And that's united both Ukrainians who are ethnic Ukrainian and Ukrainians who are ethnic Russian. They've come together. You see lots of anecdotal stories of ethnic Russians in Ukraine who are saying things like, when the war is over, I'm learning Ukrainian, I will never speak Russian again. And so whatever hopes the Russians may have that occupying part of Ukraine will somehow change the demographic position, I don't think so. I think to the extent they occupy more of Ukraine, they're going to be occupying a hostile, antagonized population. And you're already seeing in southern Ukraine, basically now guerrilla movements emerging. Last week in Kherson, which was the first major city the Russians occupied, an official there who was a collaborator, his car was blown up, and the suspicion is he was in the car at the time. But you're beginning to see this resistance develop in those areas that are occupied by the Russians. I don't think this is going to help their demographics that much. And it probably right now is accelerating the demographic decline of Russia. And that's got to be of concern in Moscow. I mean, one factoid that I remember reading about 10, 15 years ago is if you look at the Russian Far East from Lake Baikal to the Pacific Ocean, that's mostly Siberia. It's 40% of the Russian landmass. And it has lots of oil, gas, timber, gold, all kinds of neat stuff in the ground, but it doesn't have many people. It has, I think, originally had 7 million people in the 1990s. It's probably down to about 6 million now because it's really a difficult place in which to live. If you go into the Russian-Chinese border and go just 100 miles in China, there's 140 million Chinese opposite of that. And my guess is that there are a number of people, for all of the warm relations between Beijing and Moscow now, every once in a while you'll see a Chinese scholar write about the unequal treaties, the treaties in the 19th century, by which China recognizes or accepted Russian dominion over the Russian Far East. And the shrinking Russian population, I think, ought to be a real concern in Moscow.
Skip.
Thank you. I have a question on the economic sanctions that have been applied to Russia. I saw a program the other day about the fact that Russia is still bringing in revenues of $1 billion a day from oil sales. And they were very pessimistic, the two experts, about how impactful the economic sanctions can be without really cutting off that oil revenue. And it seems to me that that would be the way to really put the pressure on the Russians, but it would also put incredible pressure on the world economy and potential recessions in countries where people who are not in power, whether it be the United States or elsewhere, would be welcoming the argument that the current Western democracies are aiding in putting all of the Western population in a major recession, thereby getting themselves unelected. Comment on that.
Yeah, no, as I said, I think the one big loophole in Western sanctions now is oil and gas. this was not a problem for the United States. I mean, we imported no natural gas from Russia, and I believe that Russian oil made up about 3% of our consumption. So the Biden administration very early on banned import of Russian oil and gas. That was easy for us to do. It was only 3% of our consumption. But if you're in Europe and you're getting 30 or 35% of your oil and gas from Russia, it's a serious issue. Now, what the European Union has done is they have said they have now banned oil imports by tanker. And they're moving to reduce oil imports that come to Europe from Russia by pipeline. And if they implement what they have said, by the end of the year, they hope to cut their imports of Russian oil by 70 to 80%. That would be significant. Natural gas is going to be harder, but you now have an effort in Europe to look for sources for LNG to replace Russian piped gas. And my guess is that they're on a course now, which is probably going to take several years before they can really reduce the gas. But they have set in some countries the objective of just cutting off Russian gas forever. And they can achieve that just how quickly. But what this does, though, reinforce was already you had a move in the European Union to move away from carbon energy, to look for renewables, things like wind power, solar power, even nuclear power in France. So there was already this drive that would have naturally taken them to a position where they could reduce Russian oil and gas. This may now accelerate that. But the problem is, how do you do this in the near term? And of course, what's happened is as prices go up, the Russians are making a lot of money off of current sales. And so colleagues who work on this issue on sanctions that are smarter than me, what they've suggested is the focus, maybe instead of focusing on reducing the amount of oil and gas that come to Europe, focus on how do you reduce the amount of revenues, the money that goes to Russia. So could you do things like, and this was talked about at the G7 summit, impose a price cap on Russian oil, and then get other countries to buy in. And so tell the Russians, well, we're going to buy your oil, but we're not paying $110 a barrel. We're going to pay, say, $50 a barrel. That would make a huge cut into the Russian revenues. And then the Russians would have a choice: sell oil, and make some money, or not sell the oil. Another variant is, could the Europeans impose a tariff on imported Russian gas? And again, set that tariff so high that to the extent the Russians wanted to continue to send some gas to the European market, the Russians would have to lower the price, and you would reduce the amount of money going to Russia. And then you could even take the money collected by that tariffs and, for example, contribute that to a Ukraine reconstruction fund. So there's some ideas out there, but the problem is that over the last 30 years, the Europeans became overly dependent on Russia for energy, and they're moving in the right direction now, but it's going to take some time. Now, what ought to worry the Russians, though, is that if the Europeans complete those changes in the future, the Russians aren't going to have much of a market in Europe for Russian oil and gas, and that's going to be a huge hit to Russian export revenues.
Steve, can you hang on? We've got 3 more questions. Can you hang on for a couple more minutes?
Sure.
Super. Oh,
Thank you for your presentation, Steve. 2 questions. One, with regards to the standoff, the war of attrition, is there any idea how long Russia can hold out, and it's an even war of attrition when most of their industrial background and supplies seem to be diminishing, while Ukraine has access to the Western world, the great supplier of the U.S., the rest of NATO? And number 2, what seems to be precluding Ukraine from engaging in a tit for tat, starting launching projectiles into Russia?
Yeah.
Retaliation for what's coming into them.
Yeah. Okay. Now, on the war of attrition, I mean, it seems to me that there's the Russians, I think, first of all, they're using reportedly 50,000 shells a day for their artillery. At some point, I believe the Russians are going to begin to hit some shortages. There are already, I think, beliefs in Western militaries that the Russians have been getting to a point where they may be exhausting their supply of sophisticated precision-guided weapons. So, for example, in the last 3 or 4 weeks, we saw the Russians firing weapons at ground targets. These weapons were actually designed as anti-ship missiles. And so people say, why are they doing that? Well, maybe because they're running out of the kind of ground attack weapons. And experts who have looked at some of the Russian weapons that misfired and landed intact in Ukraine say when you open them up and look inside, they have some key components that come from the West, semiconductors, chips that are being cut off. So it's not clear how the Russians will be able to replace those to the extent they're trying to replenish their stocks of sophisticated weapons. But I think the real challenge here is going to be on the Russian side, does elite and public support for the war erode because of the economic pain of sanctions, but more importantly, because of just the large and continuing flow of Russian casualties? Does that happen before the Ukrainians, their economy collapses, or they run out of military support from the West? And right now, the West seems to be prepared. I mean, the West is preparing a lot of ammunition and arms, and these things are now just coming to the field. And for example, the HIMARS rocket system is going to give the Ukrainians, or the Ukrainians have started to use it. It gives them the capability to hit targets 50 miles away. It puts those systems out of range of Russian artillery. And the system is accurate. I mean, it's accurate to within 1 to 3 meters. So, the Ukrainians are requiring some capabilities now that will give them some real military strength. Can the West sustain that? But also, can the West, and the Ukrainian economy needs about $5 billion a month. Can the West provide that to keep the Ukrainians from collapsing? And at least right now, the answer seems to be yes. I guess my question is, can we sustain that if this goes 4, 5, 6 months down the line? So I think that's kind of the competition there in the war of attrition. On the question of tit for tat strikes, the Ukrainians have done some small strikes into Russia. But I think largely they focused more on attacking and trying to destroy key Russian elements in Ukraine. And for example, when the Ukrainians were asking for the HIMARS rocket system, in order to, I think, facilitate a decision by the Biden administration, the Ukrainians said, we will not use these systems to strike targets in Russia. So there's been a certain amount of self-limitation. I think the Ukrainians do some things. And I think in one way, they've shown remarkable restraint. But that's been part of their calculation that that kind of restraint is important to secure the kind of weapons supplies that they need from the West to sustain their ability to beat the Russians.
It's been some circle sort of a truism or at least thought that we survived our Vietnam, the Soviet Union did not survive its Vietnam, meaning the invasion of Afghanistan. Do you think that this is starting to me anyway to look an awful lot like Putin's Vietnam? Do you see it that way? And if so, do you think his regime can survive his Vietnam?
Yeah. No, I think this is the big question. I mean, over the last 22 years, Vladimir Putin has built a very autocratic system in Russia, very tightly controlled. And you have, I think, in the Russian public, I mean, Russians are different from Ukrainians. The Russians appear to be relatively passive, and they accept this autocracy in a way that the Ukrainians showed in the Orange Revolution and the Maidan Revolution. They were not prepared. So to some extent, I'm not sure the chances of the Russian public turning against Putin are large, but it's not zero. So that's one thing I would watch is, does the public attitude begin to shift? And Russian polling shows that the Russians support Putin. It shows they support the war, although when you do sophisticated polling, it's not at the 70 to 75% level of support that some Russian polls suggest. But if the public mood really begin to turn against this war, what's interesting about the Kremlin is that for a very autocratic system, they do a lot of polling and they're very sensitive to what the public feels. So if the public begins to turn, does that promote a change of course? The other thing, which I think is a small but not zero probability, is does that inner circle around Putin at some point conclude this is too expensive? We're losing too many soldiers. We're losing too much of our military is being destroyed. And you're now talking about maybe 5 to 10 years of Russian military procurement to replace everything that they've lost in Ukraine. The impact of the economic sanctions, the strengthening of NATO, the unification of the West against Russia. Do some people in the inner circle decide maybe it's time for Vladimir to retire to his huge palace down on the Black Sea, and we try to find a different course? Now, I don't think that's a very high probability, but I think it's possible. Now, the problem is, if you're in that inner circle and you think it's time for Vlad to head down to the Black Sea on his retirement, the most consequential question you're going to ask is when you ask somebody to join with you in that. That can have a big impact on your future career. So again, I think these things are possible, but not very likely. And so that's where it's hard to see where this thing goes, because if Putin continues to double down at some point, something's got to give. And we're not sure at this point that we can predict with any kind of clarity what that will be.
Suzanne has a question online. She's had her hand up for quite some time. Suzanne?
Thank you. This is quick. I guess when starting in 2014, the process started of taking over Ukraine, and I honestly thought Ukraine would fall right away. What did Russia think they would gain if Ukraine had fallen right away? I don't get the why.
Yeah. Well, I think part of it is it gets to Vladimir Putin, and what he looks at, I think he now has, and he said this pretty openly 2 months ago or 2 weeks ago, regathering what he considers historical Russian lands. And again, part of this, I believe, is I don't think Putin understands modern Ukraine. If you look at the Russian military advances in the first couple of days, the Russians seem to believe that they would be welcomed as liberators. They were surprised by the fact that they were shot up very badly. And so I thought Putin expected, well, and you see it even now, this idea that, well, maybe central Ukraine is going to be pro-West, but eastern and southern Ukraine will come over to our side. Back in 2014, after the Russians seized Crimea, for about 8 months, there was this idea in Moscow of, it was called Novorossiya, that the 7 or 8 oblasts from Kharkiv in the east all the way down to Odessa in the south would rebel, would seek independence, would seek to join Russia. And it didn't happen. And again, this expectation that there's this huge well of goodwill in Ukraine towards Russia is totally unfounded. In 2015, so this is already 7 years ago, I was part of a group. We wrote a report recommending types of U.S. military assistance for Ukraine. But the Ukrainians arranged for us to go down to Dnipropetrovsk, and then to go to Kramatorsk, which was the field headquarters for Ukrainian military operations against the Russian and Russian proxy forces in the part of Donbass that was occupied. And what was interesting to me is in this 2.5-hour drive by vehicle from Dnipro to Kramatorsk. This is in Dnipropetrovsk. This is in northern Donetsk Oblast, areas that people would have said Ukrainians there are more likely to speak Russian than they are Ukrainian as their first language. These are areas that might be more sympathetic to Russia. What we saw is every time we would pass through a town is houses and apartments flying Ukrainian flags, fences painted blue and yellow. I mean, the same sort of manifestations of Ukrainian patriotism and nationalism that you saw in central Ukraine. And this seems to have been a total surprise to the Russians. So Putin has this vision of what he's going to take. I don't think that vision has any relation to the reality of Ukraine today. And I go back talking to a Ukrainian a few months ago, and I said, is anger against Ukraine focused just on the Kremlin, or is it directed more broadly at Russians? And the response was more broadly at Russians, because they've allowed Putin to do this to us. And the kind of enmity that you now have in Ukraine towards Russia, it's going to take decades to overcome. And this is just something, I mean, Putin stumbled into he didn't stumble, I mean, he made specific decisions that led to this war, but I think they were based on total misunderstandings of Ukraine and Ukrainians. And I still find that astonishing.
Thanks, Steve. Two more quick questions. Pat?
Steve, my question is who and what after Putin steps down or is gone? Is the same philosophy, the same attitude going to continue?
Yeah. No, I think if Putin were to step off the curb of the Kremlin and get run over by a bus, the Russian system constitutionally says that the prime minister becomes the acting president for 3 months, and then there'll be a special election. But the real business is going to be taking place behind closed doors. We'll not really have a good feel for it. The Kremlin is pretty opaque to us. And my guess is that the person that emerges may well look a lot like Vladimir Putin. But if the trigger for replacing Putin is because people have concluded that this war has become such a disaster for Russia that it has to be ended, at least I think that would be a positive for Ukraine. But we're still likely to face somebody of Mr. Putin's background with Mr. Putin's world outlook. And I believe it's going to be some time to change before the Russians sort of figure out that if they want to become more of a normal country, a country that sort of is focused more on developing its economy, less preoccupied with trying to regain the past Soviet empire, that's going to take a while before you get somebody like a Gorbachev coming to office.
Jamie.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for speaking to us. My question is, why can Ukraine not embark now, after all of this period of restraint, on some kind of a targeted, on the ground, special operative guerrilla warfare in Russia and target high value positions like the Black Sea Palace or something? I'm sure this is all very much easier said than done. I don't mean to be naive, but if that could be done, let's say if it can be done, would they still choose not to do it just because they wouldn't want to harden Russian sympathies, any few that might exist? Would they just be then facing this inevitable escalation further? My feeling is that at this point, the best defense has got to be a good offense. I would think they need to bring the pain to the Russian people and take it to them in order for them to believe what's really going on and make it clear what the targets are ahead of time, communicate with to some extent, or have them be very targeted so they aren't affecting civilians. But is any of that a possibility strategically, or what do you think about that?
Well, there actually have been some strikes in Russia. Oil refineries, there have been a series of mysterious explosions. And there's suspicions that the Ukrainians are doing something. I think the Ukrainians quite wise are saying, wow, that's interesting. I wonder who did that. They're sort of avoiding claiming that. You also, though, I think, have some Russians. It's been interesting now. I think there have been 5 to 10 reports of Russian draft centers being attacked, firebombed. And people are thinking, well, that's actually a manifestation of the Russian population saying, we don't want to send our kids to war. But the Ukrainians seem to be calculating that doing some of that, but keeping it under the radar is their best strategy. And it may reflect an inability to sort of penetrate Russia, but also they're not attacking civilian targets. I think that's smart. That's important to sustain Western support. But their focus really has been on driving the Russians out. But no, I've had the same question in my own time. Couldn't the Ukrainians, who have a lot of people who speak Russian like a natural, could they not be doing some more of that? And my guess is you'll see continuing small strikes like that, but then the Ukrainians playing this, we're not sure what happened.
Alex, last question. Steve, you've been very kind. Thanks.
Yes.
One more question.
Yes, Steve, thank you very, very much for your wealth of knowledge and sharing it with us over this past hour or so. I only have one question. How does China figure into all of this?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, China has, on the one hand, rhetorically chosen not to criticize Russia, even though what the Russians are doing are really antithetical to Chinese policy. I mean, here's Russia seizing Crimea from Ukraine, recognizing the so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states. That's anathema to the Chinese, because the Chinese say, what does that mean for Taiwan or Tibet? So, but the Chinese rhetorically have not criticized the Russians. What the Chinese also have not done, at least so far, other than buying more oil, there doesn't seem to be much evidence that the Chinese are doing anything to help lessen the impact of other economic sanctions on Russia. At least so far, we've not seen reports that the Chinese are beginning to provide semiconductors, other high-tech things that the Russians can no longer purchase in the West. And my guess is that there's been some fairly quiet but very strong messages from Washington and other European capitals of Chinese. If you do this, there may be some risks for China. And I think part of this, the Chinese tend to be, and we've seen this actually since 2014, when Russians were hoping that China would alleviate some of the sanctions. The Chinese were very reluctant, and I think it was in part fear by the Chinese that if they became too overtly involved in undercutting and undermining Western sanctions on Russia, that they could become the target of secondary sanctions. And remember, from the Chinese perspective, they were doing maybe $100 billion a year of business and trade with Russia, but it was like $500 billion a year with the United States and an equal amount with Europe. So there's some real economic, there's a lot of money involved with the West they don't want to endanger. So I think that's kept them careful about how much aid they give to the Russians. I guess the last observation I'd make, though, is I think the Chinese are missing an opportunity here. To the extent that China wants to portray itself as a rising superpower that can contribute to stability and security in the world, that can do good things. Nobody in the world has more influence now with Vladimir Putin than President Xi of China. And he has, from what I can see, done nothing at all to use that influence to try to end this war. And I think people are noticing that. And what does it say about the kind of role that China is going to play as China comes into its own? So far they're not being a using influence in a positive way that would be not only helpful perhaps in ending this war to Russia and Ukraine, but also would help avert, I think, what's going to be a food crisis in places like the Middle East and Africa, because of the difficulties that countries like Ukraine now have in getting their food products to global markets.
Stephen, I have one comment and one question, and then we'll thank you with enormous gratitude. The comment is, Rotarians have been doing something a lot in Ukraine so far. We've got the emergency fund set up and helping along the border. Is there something more that the Rotary and or Rotarians we can be doing to help this situation in the Ukraine?
No, I think keep doing what you're doing. No, it's really been interesting to me. I mean, just in the Bay Area at Stanford, Stanford students have organized. There's a group called Nova Ukraine, which is set up by Stanford students that's providing funding to Ukraine. There's a group called telemedicine, organized by 3 or 4 Stanford students that have, I think, about 50 doctors now who are doing long-range virtual consultations with Ukrainians who are either in Ukraine or say in Poland on medical issues. So there's a huge amount that's being done, and I think every little bit helps. So keep doing what you're good at doing.